Part 14, Realm and Commonwealth by Spiers. Copyright 2018. Article the 6th. Whereas by the former Treaty of Peace, Paris, that portion of the boundary of the United States, from the point where the 45th degree of north latitude strikes the river Iroquois or Chateauguay to the Lake Superior, was declared to be along the middle of said river into Lake Ontario, through the middle of said lake until it strikes the communication by water between that lake and Lake Erie, thence along the middle of said communication into Lake Erie, through the middle of said lake until it arrives at the water communication into Lake Huron, thence through the middle of said lake to the water communication between the lake and Lake Superior. And whereas doubts have arisen what was the middle of the said river, lakes, and water communications, and whether certain islands lying in the same were within the dominions of His Britannic Majesty or of the United States. In order, therefore, finally to decide these doubts, they shall be referred to 2 commissioners to be appointed, sworn, and authorized to act exactly in the manner directed with respect to those mentioned in the next preceding article, unless otherwise specified in this present article. The said commissioners shall meet in the first instance at Albany, in the state of New York, and shall have power to adjourn to such place or other places as they shall think fit. The said commissioners shall, by a report or declaration under their hands and seals, designate the boundary through the said rivers, lakes, and water communications, and decide to which of the 2 contracting parties the several islands lying within the said rivers, lakes, and water communications do respectively belong, in conformity with the true intent of the said treaty of 1783. And both parties agree to consider such designation and decision as final and conclusive. And in the event of the said 2 commissioners differing, or both or either of them refusing, declining, or wilfully omitting to act, such reports, declarations, or statements shall be made by them on either of them, and such reference to a friendly sovereign or state shall be made in all respects as in the latter part of the 4th article is contained, and in as full a manner as if the same was herein repeated. Article the 7th. It is further agreed that the said 2 last mentioned commissioners, after they shall have executed the duties assigned to them in the preceding article, shall be, and they are hereby authorized upon their oaths impartially to fix and determine, according to the true intent of the said Treaty of Peace, Paris, of 1783, that part of the boundary between the dominions of the 2 powers, which extends from the water communication between Lake Huron and Lake Superior to the most north-western point of the Lake of the Woods, to decide to which of the 2 parties the several islands lying in the lakes, water communications, and rivers forming the said boundaries do respectively belong, in conformity with the true intent of the said Treaty of Peace, Paris, of 1783, and to cause such parts of the said boundary as required it to be surveyed and marked. The said commissioners shall by a report or declaration under their hands and seals designate the boundary aforesaid, state their decision on the points thus referred to them, and particularize the latitude and longitude of the most north-western point of the Lake of the Woods, and of such other parts of the said boundary as they may deem proper. And both parties agree to consider such designation and decision as final and conclusive. And in the event of the said 2 commissioners differing, or both or either of them refusing, declining, or wilfully omitting to act, such reports, declarations, or statements shall be made by them or either of them, and such reference to a friendly sovereign or state shall be made in all respects as in the latter part of the fourth article is contained, and in as full a manner as if the same was herein revealed. Article the 8th. The several boards of 2 commissioners mentioned in the 4 preceding articles shall respectively have power to appoint a secretary, and to employ such surveyors or other persons as they shall judge necessary. Duplicates of all their respective reports, declarations, statements, and decisions, and of their accounts, and of the journal of their proceedings shall be delivered by them to the agents of His Britannic Majesty and to the agents of the United States, who may be respectively appointed and authorized to manage the business on behalf of their respective governments. The said commissioners shall be respectively paid in such a manner as shall be agreed between the 2 contracting parties, such agreement being to be settled at the time of the exchange of the ratifications of this treaty, and all other expenses attending the said commissions shall be defrayed equally by the 2 parties. And in the case of death, sickness, resignation, or necessary absence, the place of every such commissioner respectively shall be supplied in the same manner as such commissioner was first appointed, and the new commissioner shall take the same oath or affirmation and do the same duties. It is further agreed between the 2 contracting parties that in the case of the islands mentioned in any of the preceding articles, which were in the possession of one of the parties prior to the commencement of the present war between the 2 countries, should be the division of any of the boards of commissioners aforesaid, or of the sovereign or state so referred to, as in the 4 next preceding articles contained, fall within the dominions of the other party. All grants of land made previous to the commencement of the war by the party having had such possession shall be as valid as if such island or islands had by such decision or decisions been adjudged to be within the dominions of the party having had such possession. Article the 9th. The United States of America engaged to put an end immediately after the ratification of the present treaty to hostilities with all the tribes or nations of Indians with whom they may be at war at the time of such ratification, and forthwith to restore to such tribes and nations respectfully all the possessions, rights, and privileges which they may have enjoyed or been entitled to in 1811 previous to such hostilities, provided always that such tribes or nations shall agree to desist from all hostilities against the United States of America, their citizens and subjects, upon the ratification of the present treaty being notified to such tribes or nations, and shall so desist accordingly. And His Britannic Majesty engages on his part to put an end immediately after the ratification of the present treaty to hostilities with all the tribes and nations of Indians with whom he may be at war at the time of such ratification, and forthwith to restore to such tribes or nations respectfully all the possessions, rights, and privileges which they may have enjoyed or been entitled to in 1811 previous to such hostilities, provided always that such tribes or nations shall agree to desist from all hostilities against His Britannic Majesty and his subjects upon the ratification of the present treaty being notified to such tribes or nations, and shall so desist accordingly. Article the 10th. Whereas the traffic in slaves is irreconcilable with the principles of humanity and justice, and whereas both His Majesty and the United States are desirous of continuing their efforts to promote its entire abolition, it is hereby agreed that both the contracting parties shall use their best endeavours to accomplish so desired an object. Article the 11th. The treaty, when the same shall have been ratified on both sides without alteration by either of the contracting parties, and the ratifications mutually exchanged, shall be binding on both parties, and the ratifications shall be exchanged at Washington in the space of 4 months from this day, or sooner if practicable. In faith whereof we, the respective plenipotentiaries, have signed this treaty, and have hereunto affixed our seals, done in triplicate at Ghent on the 24th day of December 1814. Gambia, seal. Henry Goulburn, seal. William Adams, seal. John Quincy Adams, seal. J. A. Bayard, seal. H. Clay, seal. John Russell, seal. Albert Gallatin, seal. December 24, 1814. The definitive Treaty of Paris, sealed in 1783, saw the recognition of a list of plenipotentiaries sign off on the articles as follows. Attendees to this worldwide initiative included the King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, Arch-Treasurer and Prince-Elector of the Holy Roman Empire, the United States of America, and the Duke of Brunswick and Lüneburg. As can be seen by the introductory paragraph, the treaty main aim was to establish and forget all past misunderstandings and differences that have unhappily interrupted the good correspondence and friendship which they mutually wish to restore. It goes on to explain the want to begin discourse and correspondence, and then the articles of agreement taken between the various attendees, whether as a group or between each other. The Definitive Treaty of Peace, 1783, in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. It having pleased the divine providence to dispose the hearts of the most serene and most potent Prince George III, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, Duke of Brunswick and Lüneburg, Arch-Treasurer and Prince-Elector of the Holy Roman Empire, etc., and of the United States of America, to forget all past misunderstandings and differences that have unhappily interrupted the good correspondence and friendship which they mutually wish to restore, and to establish such a beneficial and satisfactory intercourse between the two countries upon the ground of reciprocal advantages and mutual convenience as may promote and secure to both perpetual peace and harmony. And having for this desirable end already laid the foundation of peace and reconciliation by the provisional articles signed at Paris on the 30th of November 1782, by the commissioners empowered on each part, which articles were agreed to be inserted in and constitute the treaty of peace proposed to be concluded between the Crown of Great Britain and the said United States, but which treaty was not to be concluded until terms of peace should be agreed upon between Great Britain and France, and His Britannic Majesty should be ready to conclude such treaty accordingly. And the treaty between Great Britain and France having since been concluded, His Britannic Majesty and the United States of America, in order to carry into full effect the provisional articles above mentioned, according to the tenor thereof, have constituted and appointed, that is to say, His Britannic Majesty on his part, David Hartley, Esquire, member of the Parliament of Great Britain, and the said United States on their part, John Adams, Esquire, late of Commissioner of the United States of America at the Court of Versailles, late delegate in Congress from the state of Massachusetts, and Chief Justice of the said state, and Minister Plenipotentiary of the said United States, to their High Mightiness the States General of the United Netherlands, Benjamin Franklin, Esquire, late delegate in Congress from the state of Pennsylvania, President of the Convention of the said state, and Minister Plenipotentiary from the United States of America at the Court of Versailles, John J. Esquire, late President of Congress and Chief Justice of the State of New York, and Minister Plenipotentiary from the said United States at the Court of Madrid, to be plenipotentiaries for the concluding and signing the present definitive treaty, who, after having reciprocally communicated their respective full powers, have agreed upon and confirmed the following articles. Article 1. His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States, viz., New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia to be free, sovereign, and independent states, that he treats with them as such, and for himself, his heirs and successors, relinquishes all claims to the government, propriety, and territorial rights of the same and every part thereof. Article 2. And that all disputes which might arise in future on the subject of the boundaries of the said United States may be prevented, it is hereby agreed and declared that the following are and shall be their boundaries, viz., from the north-west angle of Nova Scotia, viz., that angle which is formed by a line drawn due north from the source of the St. Croix River to the highlands, along the said highlands which divide those rivers that empty themselves into the river of St. Lawrence, from those which fall into the Atlantic Ocean, to the north-westernmost head of Connecticut River, thence down along the middle of that river to the 45th degree of north latitude, from thence by a line due west on said latitude until it strikes the river Iroquois or Catacray, thence along the middle of said river into Lake Ontario, through the middle of said lake until it strikes the communication by water between the lake and Lake Erie, thence along the middle of said communication into Lake Erie, through the middle of said lake until it arrives at the water communication between that lake and Lake Huron, thence along the middle of said water communication into Lake Huron, thence through the middle of said lake to the water communication between the lake and Lake Superior, thence through Lake Superior northwards of the Isles Royal and Philippaux to the Long Lake, thence through the middle of said Long Lake and the water communication between it and the Lake of the Woods to the said Lake of the Woods, thence through the said lake to the most northwestern point thereof, and from thence on a due west course to the river Mississippi, thence by a line to be drawn along the middle of the said river Mississippi until it shall interact the northernmost part of the 31st degree of north latitude, south by a line to be drawn due east from the determination of the line last mentioned in the latitude of 31 degrees of the equator, to the middle of the river Apalachicola or Chattahoochee, thence along the middle thereof to its junction with the Flint River, thence straight to the head of St. Mary's River, and thence down along the middle of St. Mary's River to the Atlantic Ocean, east by a line to be drawn along the middle of the river St. Croix, from its mouth in the Bay of Fundy to its source, and from its source directly north to the aforesaid highlands which divide the rivers that fall into the Atlantic Ocean from those which fall into the river St. Lawrence, comprehending all islands within 20 leagues of any part of the shores of the United States, and lying between lines to be drawn due east from the points where the aforesaid boundaries between Nova Scotia on the one part and East Florida on the other shall respectively touch the Bay of Fundy and the Atlantic Ocean, excepting such islands as now are or heretofore have been within the limits of the said province of Nova Scotia. Article 3. It is agreed that the people of the United States shall continue to enjoy unmolested the right to take fish of every kind on the Grand Bank, and on all the other banks of Newfoundland, also in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and at all other places in the sea where the inhabitants of both countries used at any time heretofore to fish, and also that the inhabitants of the United States shall have liberty to take fish of every kind on such part of the coast of Newfoundland as British fishermen shall use, but not to dry or cure the same on that island, and also on the coasts, bays, and creeks of all other of His Britannic Majesty's dominions in America, and that the American fishermen shall have liberty to dry and cure fish in any of the unsettled bays, harbours, and creeks of Nova Scotia, Magdalen Islands, and Labrador, so long as they shall remain unsettled, but so soon as the same or either of them shall be settled, it shall not be lawful for the said fishermen to dry or cure fish at such settlements without a previous agreement for that purpose with the inhabitants, proprietors, or possessors of the ground. Article 4. It is agreed that creditors on either side shall meet with no lawful impediment to the recovery of the full value in sterling money of all bona fide debts theretofore contracted. Article 5. It is agreed that Congress shall earnestly recommend it to the legislatures of the respective states to provide for the restitution of all estates, rights, and properties which have been confiscated belonging to real British subjects, and also of the estates, rights, and properties of persons resident in districts in the possession on His Majesty's arms, and who have not borne arms against the said United States, and that persons of any other description shall have free liberty to go to any part or parts of any of the 13 United States, and therein to remain 12 months unmolested in their endeavours to obtain the restitution of such of their estates, rights, and properties as may have been confiscated, and that Congress shall also earnestly recommend to the several states a reconsideration and revision of all acts or laws regarding the premises, so as to render the said laws or acts perfectly consistent, not only with justice and equity, but with that spirit of conciliation which, on the return of the blessings of peace, should universally prevail, and that Congress shall also earnestly recommend to the several states that the estates, rights, and properties of such last mentioned persons shall be restored to them, they refunding to any persons who may be now in possession the bona fide price, whereas any has been given, which such persons may have paid on purchasing any of the said lands, rights, or properties since the confiscation. And it is agreed that all persons who have any interest in confiscated lands, either by debts, marriage settlements, or otherwise, shall meet with no lawful impediment in the prosecution of their just rights. Article 6. That there shall be no future confiscations made, nor any prosecutions commenced against any person or persons for, or by reason of, the part which he or they may have taken in the present war, and that no person shall on that account suffer any future loss or damage either to his person, liberty, or property, and that those who may be confinement on such charges at the time of the ratification of the treaty in America shall be immediately set at liberty, and the prosecutions so commenced be discontinued. Article 7. There shall be a firm and perpetual peace between His Britannic Majesty and the said states, and between the subjects of the one and the citizens of the other, wherefore all hostilities both by sea and land shall from henceforth cease. All prisoners on both sides shall be set at liberty, and His Britannic Majesty shall, with all convenient speed, and without causing any destruction or carrying away any negroes or other property of the American inhabitants, withdraw all his armies, garrisons, and fleets from the said United States, and from every post, place, and harbour within the same, leaving in all fortifications the American artillery that may be therein, and shall also order and cause all archives, records, deeds, and papers belonging to any of the said states or their citizens, which in the course of the war may have fallen into the hands of his officers, to be forthwith restored and delivered to the proper states and persons to whom they belong. Article 8. The navigation of the river Mississippi from its source to the ocean shall for ever remain free and open to the subjects of Great Britain and the citizens of the United States. Article 9. In case it should so happen that any place or territory belonging to Great Britain or to the United States should have been conquered by the arms of either from the other before the arrival of the said provisional articles in America, it is agreed that the same shall be restored without difficulty and without requiring any compensation. Article 10. The solemn ratifications of the present treaty, expedited in good and due form, shall be exchanged between the contracting parties in the space of 6 months or sooner, if possible, to be computed from the day of the signatures of the present treaty. In witness whereof we, the undersigned, their ministers plenipotentiary, have in their name and in virtue, and of our full powers, signed with our hands the present definitive treaty, and caused the seals of our arms to be affixed thereto, done at Paris this 3rd day of September, in the year of our Lord 1783. D. Hartley, seal. John Adams, seal. B. Franklin, seal. John J., seal. September 30, 1783. Post-peace treaty at Paris and War of 1812, leading to second treaty of Paris with the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the United States of America, had sealed its self-determination on a world stage, being so named in 2 treaties after the impacts of warfare causing the defense of a declared independent nation. Civil war enveloped the United States, the Confederate States taking on the forces of the Lincoln Army, taking orders out of Washington, D.C., formerly a slice of the Commonwealth of Virginia, formerly the Virginia Company of London, chartered under King James I in 1606. Abraham Lincoln, taking advice from Joseph Lieber in a military standpoint, writes rules of engagement for the United States Army that had fulfilled its position in taking the country into governance post-Civil War. The Lieber Code became General Orders 100 of the United States Army under Abraham Lincoln as President and Postmaster of the company. Abraham Lincoln was known to have emancipated slaves from the states in which he took control. This is reflected in the rules of engagement put in place in 1863 and carry on through today in Field Manual FM 2470 of the current United States Army field positions throughout the Commonwealth of Australia and the world. U.S. Army Doctrine and Belligerent Occupation. A monograph by Major Christopher Todd Burgess, United States Army, School of Advanced Military Studies, United States Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. First term, AY 03-04. Correspondence, orders, reports, and returns of the Union authorities. From January 1 to December 31, 1863. Number 7. O.R. Series 3, Volume 3, S 124. General Orders Number 100. War Department, Adjutant General's Office, Washington, April 24, 1863. The following instructions for the Government of Armies of the United States in the field, prepared by Francis Lieber, LL.D., and revised by a Board of Officers, of which Major General E. A. Hitchcock is President. Having been approved by the President of the United States, he commands that they be published for the information of all concerned. By order of the Secretary of War, E. D. Townsville, Assistant Adjutant General. Instructions for the Government of Armies of the United States in the field. Section 1. Martial Law. Military Jurisdiction, Military Necessity, Retaliation. 1. A place, district, or country occupied by an enemy stands in consequence of the occupation. Under the martial law of the invading or occupying army, whether any proclaimed declared martial law or any public warning to the inhabitants has been issued or not, martial law is the immediate and direct effect and consequence of occupation or conquest. The presence of a hostile army proclaims its martial law. 2. Martial law does not cease during the hostile occupation, except by special proclamation, ordered by the Commander-in-Chief, or by special mention in the treaty of peace concluding the war. When the occupation of a place or territory continues beyond the conclusion of peace as one of the conditions of the same. 3. Martial law in a hostile country consists in the suspension by the occupying military authority of the criminal and civil law and of the domestic administration and government in the occupied place or territory, and in the substitution of military rule and force for the same, as well as in the dictation of general laws as far as military necessity requires this suspension, substitution, or dictation. The commander of the forces may proclaim that the administration of all civil and penal law shall continue either wholly or in part, as in times of peace, unless otherwise ordered by the military authority. 4. Martial law is simply military authority exercised in accordance with the laws and usages of war. Military oppression is not martial law. It is the abuse of the power which that law confers. As martial law is executed by military force, it is incumbent upon those who administer it to be strictly guided by the principles of justice, honour, and humanity, virtues adorning a soldier, even more than other men, for the very reason that he possesses the power of his arms against the unarmed. 5. The martial law shall be less stringent in places and countries fully occupied and fairly conquered. Much greater severity may be exercised in places or regions where actual hostilities exist or are expected and must be prepared for. Its most complete sway is allowed even in the commander's own country, when face to face with the enemy, because of the absolute necessity of the case and of the paramount duty to defend the country against invasion. to save the country is paramount to all other considerations. 6. All civil and penal law shall continue to take its usual course in the enemy's places and territories under martial law, unless interrupted or stopped by order of the occupying military power. But all the functions of the hostile government, legislative, executive, or administrative, whether of a general, provincial, or local character, cease under martial law, and continue only with the sanction, or if deemed necessary, the participation of the occupier or invader. 7. Martial law extends to property and to persons, whether they are subject of the enemy or aliens to that government. 8. Consuls amongst American and European nations are not diplomatic agents. Nevertheless, their officers and persons will be subject to martial law in cases of urgent necessity only. Their property and businesses are not exempted. Any delinquency they commit against the established military rule may be punished as in the case of any other inhabitant, and such punishment furnishes no reasonable ground for international complaint. 9. The functions of ambassadors, ministers, or other diplomatic agents accredited by neutral powers to the hostile government cease so far as regards the displaced government, but the conquering or occupying power shall recognize them as temporarily accredited to itself. 10. Martial law affects chiefly the police and collection of public revenue and taxes, whether imposed by the expelled government or by the invader, and refers mainly to the support and efficiency of the army, its safety, and the safety of its operations. 11. The law of war does not only disclaim all cruelty and bad faith concerning engagements concluding with the enemy during the war, but also the breaking of stipulations solemnly contracted by the belligerents in time of peace, and avowedly intended to remain in force in case of war between the contracting parties. It disclaims all extortions and other transactions for individual gain, all acts of private revenge or connivance at such acts. Offences to the contrary shall be severely punished, and especially so if committed by officers. 12. Whenever feasible, martial law is carried out in cases of individual offenders by military court, but sentences of death shall be executed only with the approval of the chief executive, provided the urgency of the case does not require a speedier execution, and then only with the approval of the chief commander. 13. Military jurisdiction is of two kinds. First, that which is conferred and defined by statute. Second, that which is derived from the common law of war. Military offences under the statute law must be tried in a manner therein directed, but military offences which do not come within the statute must be tried and punished under the common law of war. The character of the courts which exercise these jurisdictions depends upon the local laws of each particular country. In the armies of the United States, the first is exercised by courts martial, while cases which do not come in within the rules and articles of war, or the jurisdiction conferred by statute on courts martial, are tried by military commissions. 14. Military necessity, as understood by modern civilized nations, consists in the necessity of those measures which are indispensable for securing the ends of the war, and which are lawful according to the modern law and usages of war. 15. The military necessity admits of all direct destruction of life or limb of armed enemies, and of other persons whose destruction is incidentally unavoidable in the armed contests of the war. It allows for the capturing of every armed enemy and every enemy of importance to the hostile government or of peculiar danger to the captor. It allows for all destruction of property and obstruction of the ways and channels of traffic, travel, or communication, and of all withholding of sustenance or means of life from the enemy, of the appropriation of whatever an enemy's country affords necessary for the subsistence and safety of the army, and of such deception as does not involve the breaking of good faith, either positively pledged regarding agreements entered into during the war or supposedly by the modern law of war to exist. Men who take up arms against one another in public war do not cease on this account to be moral beings responsible to one another and to God. 16. Military necessity does not admit of cruelty. That is, the infliction of suffering for the sake of suffering, or for revenge, nor for maiming or wounding except in fight, nor of torture to extort confessions. It does not admit of the use of poison in any way, nor of a wanton devastation of a district. It admits of deception, but disclaims acts of perfidy, and in general, military necessity does not include any act of hostility which makes the return to peace unnecessarily difficult. 17. War is not carried on by arms alone. It is lawful to starve the hostile belligerents, armed or unarmed, so that it leads to the speedier subjugation of the enemy. 18. When a commander of a besieged place expels a non-combatant in order to lessen the number of those who consume his stocks of provisions, it is lawful, through an extreme measure, to drive them back so as to hasten on the surrender. 19. Commanders, whenever admissible, inform the enemy of their intention to bombard a place, so that non-combatants, and especially the women and children, may be removed before the bombardment commences, but it is no infraction of the common law of war to admit thus to inform the enemy. Surprise may be a necessity. 20. Public war is a state of armed hostility between sovereign nations or governments. It is a law and requisite of civilized existence that men live in political, continuous societies forming organized units called states or nations, whose constituents bear, enjoy, and suffer, advance and retrograde together, in peace and in war. 21. The citizen or native of a hostile country is thus an enemy as one of the constituents of the hostile state or nation, and as such is subjected to the hardships of war. 22. Nevertheless, a civilian has advanced during the last century, so has likewise steadily advanced, especially in war on land, the distinction between the private individual belonging to a hostile country and the hostile country itself with its men in arms. The principle has been more and more acknowledged that the unarmed citizen is to be spared in person, property, and honour as much as the exigencies of war will admit. 23. Private citizens are no longer murdered, enslaved, or carried off to distant parts, and the inoffensive individual is as little disturbed in his private relations as the commander of the hostile troops can afford to grant in the overruling demands of a vigorous war. 24. The almost universal rule in remote times was and continues to be with barbarous armies that the private individual of the hostile country is destined to suffer every privation of liberty and protection and every disruption of family ties. Protection was and still is with uncivilized people the exception. 25. The modern regular wars of the Europeans and their descendants in other portions of the globe, protection of the inoffensive citizens of the hostile country is the rule. Privation and disturbance of private relations are the exceptions. 26. Commanding generals may cause the magistrates and civil officers of the hostile country to take the oath of temporary allegiance or an oath of fidelity to their own victorious government or rulers, and they may expel every one who declines to do so. But whether they do so or not, the people and their civil officers owe strict obedience to them as long as they hold sway over the district or country at the peril of their lives. 27. The law of war can no more wholly dispense with retaliation than can the law of nations, of which it is a branch. Yet civilized nations acknowledge retaliation as the sternest feature of war. A reckless enemy often leaves his opponent no other means of securing himself against the repetition of barbarous outrage. 28. Retaliation will therefore never be resorted to as a measure of mere revenge, but only as a means of protective retribution, and moreover cautiously and unavoidably. That is to say, retaliation shall only be resorted to after careful inquiry into the real occurrence and the character of the misdeeds that may demand retribution. Unjust or inconsiderate retaliation removes the belligerents farther and farther from the mitigating rules of regular war, and by rapid steps leads them nearer to the internecine wars of savages. 29. Modern times are distinguished from early ages by the existence at one and at the same time of many nations and great governments related to one another in close intercourse. Peace is their normal condition, war is the exception. The ultimate object of all modern war is a renewed state of peace. The most vigorously wars are pursued, the better it is for humanity. Sharp wars are brief. 30. Ever since the formation and coexistence of modern nations, and ever since wars have become great national wars, war has come to be acknowledged not to be its own end, but the means to obtain great ends of state, or to consist in defence against wrong, and no conventional restriction of the modes adopted to injure the enemy is any longer admitted, but the law of war imposes many limitations and restrictions on principles of justice, faith, and honour. Section 2. Public and private property of the enemy, protection of persons, and especially of women, of religion, the arts and sciences, punishment of crimes against the inhabitants of hostile countries.